Righty. Hello, everybody. We're just going to wait for folks to kind of trickle in here from the waiting room. Give ourselves a few minutes. And this is where I wish I had prepared some stand-up comedy, but I don't have any.
There's always horribly plain background music.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should do a little bit better about thinking about this part of this part of it next time. So just for those who are joining, we're just waiting, a few, like maybe a minute, just to let people join, and then we'll get started.
At least you're not asking us to share fun facts. I've had that as the dead space between as a panel, virtual panelist. Like, and the people come in halfway or like, wait, what was that? So.
I was accepted. I thought I was joining this about this other thing. Yeah. Well, we're gonna have lots of time for like battle scar stories, so we don't want anybody to miss out on those. All right, I think we have like enough of a quorum to at least get started and at least do intros. So welcome everybody to another Build Better webinar. With a new administration on the horizon, there's talk of potential tariffs again, ranging from between 10 to 60% on goods from places like China, potentially even Mexico, Canada, others around the world. Don't know yet. We don't have those answers, but we're here to talk about some of the implications of that. We saw something similar back in 2018 under the same leadership, but this time around, the talk is more broad and there seems to be a lot more uncertainty around what is actually going to be implemented. So I'm really excited to have some real expertise on this panel. And based on our preparation work over the last few weeks, buckle up because this is going to be a hard-hitting discussion. So I'm joined by Scott Raymond, who is an advisor who formerly led operations and supply chain at Eero, August, and Latch. He successfully navigated factory moves during the 2018 tariffs and can share about his experience, pitfalls to avoid, lessons learned, all of that from the front lines. We have Gabrielle Griffith, who is a trade compliance expert with over 20 years of experience across government, retail, and high tech. She has extensive experience navigating fast-changing trade and sanction regulations, both import and export. She will provide ideas for companies to remain compliant and competitive during this challenging time. And then we have Jen McCabe, who is a director at PwC. She formerly led teams at Foxconn, Jabil, and Flex, and has developed practical hands-on strategies to know whether CMs are adequately prepared and equipped with effective contingency plans in the event of these kinds of changes. And I think she gives us that other side of the table as well, from the manufacturing side of what to think about as in regards to tariffs. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Welcome to all of our guests and to all those who are joining us for this conversation. We will have a Q&A, so during the session, if you have thoughts, please use the Q&A tool down below, and we'll preserve time to get to your hard-hitting questions. But before that, we have some prepared discussion to talk about. So let's start with a few stories. So we're gonna go across the panel, and I'd love to hear about what you were doing back in 2018 and what you had to live through. And if you learned something, that'd be great to share too. But let's kind of use that as a way to introduce yourself to our audience. So Scott, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think in 2018, we had a lot of uncertainty around the noise and what it was going to be, what it meant. The biggest takeaways, I mean, it took us 2 years. We actually didn't we didn't get the factory up and running until September of 2020. We had to do it virtually because, as you may remember, in fall and summer of 2020, nobody was allowed to travel anywhere. So that was an interesting wrench in our process. But looking back on it, there's a lot of speculation. I think starting with the facts, right? And this is a great discussion because we've got, the sort of 360 degrees of perspective here. Start with the facts, start with what we know, start with where your existing supply chain is, begin those discussions yesterday. Start there, and you'll learn more as you go. But starting with the facts is, I think, a great place to begin all of this.
Gabrielle?
Yeah, it's funny. You asked me in our prep if I haven't stopped talking about tariffs since 2018, and I always respond to that and saying tariffs have been around since the dawn of day. Trade and tariffs it's really not a 2018 since thing. Obviously reached a bit of a crescendo in 2018, and lots of war stories and fun stories as well to share. But I think the two main lessons and kind of the two biggest pain points I saw come out of 2018 with companies, you know, to kind of piggyback on what Scott said, companies who didn't know the facts. And we're going to drill into what specifically the facts mean. But in my world, what the facts mean is your tariff classification code and your country of origin. And companies who didn't really have that on lock really felt a world of pain. So I would say that, you know, you can't really make any calls and plays until you really know your facts. And the inverse of that, because those are all import centric, because the facts drive your tariff code, was that companies who moved supply chains or who shifted contract manufacturing, what companies don't understand is that your product, whether it be a tangible piece of hardware or software, or even just a thought, can be export controlled. And I'm going to get more into that later, but we saw a lot of companies who shifted production on what we call export control technology, strictly in English, what that means is the recipe for your item. And when that is export controlled, that recipe, it might require licensing from the government. So we had some clients who moved technology, the recipe, into different contract manufacturers or into countries, into nationalities that should have worked on it. So it's not only knowing the facts to affect your import and your tariff classification code, but it's knowing whether your recipe for your product is export controlled.
All right. Jen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tariffs. Apologies for the cold voice. This was not a contingency I planned for, so bear with me. 'Tis the season. In the end of 2018, I had jumped outside of contract manufacturing. In the beginning of 2019, I jumped into a startup team that was slimly resourced. Not if this sounds familiar, or thumbs up if this sounds familiar. Slimly resourced, didn't have a dedicated distribution, sales, or logistics team, and was simultaneously designing the product as we were searching for our contract manufacturing partner and negotiating with key vendors. So right as COVID hit, I was flying back from China into New York. Ended up taking the train home from New York early. We were in the very early portion of the discovery phase for our new product introduction, which was ironically for a wellness-based wearable device. And so pretty immediately we started noticing things happening, including massive factory shutdowns. The supply chain it's like somebody took an Etch-a-Sketch and shook it. Things like dock dates were out the window. There was zero predictability. And around this, we were trying to keep the team healthy and relatively together. We were trying to design a new product, and we were trying to build key relationships with our contract manufacturer and vendors overseas, most of whom were in China, Taiwan, and a few in other territories. We knew that we would have to ship to the US direct. So we were researching things like HTS codes, et cetera. But we saw effects like our bill of materials costs going anywhere from between 3 and 15x above baseline in less than a 1-year period. You set tariffs aside for a minute. We saw the projections that we were building into our unit cost target for tariffs, go from 3x to 8x over a 1-year period. And trying to communicate this to our potential customers, much less our investors, was a huge job. So I would say, in some ways, we have the benefit of experience this time around. We sort of can predict what to expect based on what happened with this administration previously, but we also know that there are some new suggested provisions and quirks in what we're predicting for this time around. So we hope that you sit back, strap in, and we can give you the benefit of our experience so you don't have to make all of the same mistakes.
That's a great way of putting it, Jen. All right, so we had a bunch of terms kind of get thrown out already in these introduction. And so just so we don't assume that everybody is already on the same page about some of the basic terms, maybe Gabrielle, could you please help us kind of define a couple of these? I think we've identified 4 that would be useful. So maybe country of origin, how should we define that?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a fairly lengthy definition, but in short, it's the country of the manufacture, the production, or the growth of an article entering the United States. The addition within the regulations of that is that further work done in another country must affect a substantial transformation. So you hear the word country of origin. So obviously that is where your product is made, manufactured. But if you are manufacturing a product that consists of components from different countries, then the next magical term is substantial transformation. And that, unfortunately, in our world is not a regulatory defined term. Country of origin, black and white in the regs, substantial transformation, unfortunately not. At a high level, it is a customs view substantial transformation as something that is considered a major assembly, so not a minor assembly. So at a high level, the way I always describe this is if you are making a jigsaw puzzle in China and you're making the box and you're making your puzzle pieces in China, packing it in the box and then making it into the actual puzzle and assembling it in Mexico, not a substantial transformation. You are producing and manufacturing in China with the intent to make a puzzle in China. So substantial transformation really has to render a new and unique article. There's some further nuances there. What are the other terms? List, I think.
The HTS codes and
Yep.
list.
Okay, HTS codes. So I'm going to kind of talk about this in an umbrella. So there's HS codes, which is the harmonized schedule codes. HTS is the United States' version of the HS. So the HS is a numerical code that classifies imported goods that allow a country's customs officials to determine duty rate and any other regulations that apply. It is umbrellaed under the World Customs Organization, which is why you'll see on invoices often the first 6 digits. In the United States, it's a 10-digit code. The first 6 digits are more or less universal in our friendly and participating countries, which is most, except for a handful. So that said, the HTS is important because those last 4 are dictated by our United States government. And that mattered a lot when it comes to the 4th term, which is the lists, because the lists had to do with Section 301. Section 301, aka the China tariffs, that was, if you lived through that, you know that they were published and enforced in kind of these waves of what we call lists. So the first list, 1, listed hundreds of tariff codes, HTS codes, that were considered to be subject to the 25% ad valorem duty, mostly surrounding tech products, semiconductor, items that were considered kind of higher risk and to threaten the United States' ability to produce them. Then list 2 rolled out, and the list got broader and broader. So there's 4 lists total. And through this all, the enforcement of these 10-digit codes, exceptions were then published. And those exceptions were at like we call them the 8th, 9th, and 10th digits. So really, really detailed, which is why, going back to what Scott said, knowing your facts, you have to know your tariff code so well and be prepared to defend it so well. And when we saw those exceptions be published from the list, we were able to cross-reference tariff codes and say, okay, well, this list captures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But if the last digit is 8, and here's what you have to do from a tariff engineering standpoint to make it 8 versus 9, and therefore subject. So it's kind of this patchwork, right? So it's the country of origin pairing with your tariff code dictates the impact of your duties, section tariffs on China, and then will definitely be the enforcement mechanism on how we will see any future tariffs roll out.
Yeah, and I think speaking about the list and the codes, I think, Scott, you had a learning from your prior experience around like knowing your code because you wanted to know who else was in your bucket. Could you maybe share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that you can do is look to see what other companies and what other products are being imported. It's generally available, pretty easy to find. What we found, and this goes to Gabrielle's point about those last digits, there's an HTS code that captures devices for digital transfer of information. So it's pretty broad. It was pretty broad. Anything using Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, etc. that wasn't right. It captured a lot. What we noticed was that we had an 800-pound gorilla using that code with us, which was Apple. So while everybody was in this flurry of lobbying and letter writing, we sort of got to divert our resources and time relying on the fact that they would have a much stronger punch than we ever would. And we could be doing, again, like Jen, we were a small team. Everything we were doing in this was a trade-off of something else we weren't doing. So that saved us from one more step we didn't have to pursue, the letter writing, the engagement of lobbyists. We could let somebody else do that on our behalf. What ended up happening is that customs split the HTS code. We were in an other category. They called out routers and hit the router subcategory with the 25% tariff, and everything else that was a non-router was then at, I think, a 7.5% tariff. So know your facts, know who's there, and use that to guide how you're making decisions and where you're putting resources.
And know that I guess the rules could change
And
later.
and it is constantly changing. I mean, yes, it is. We will learn more every day, every week. Keep updating the facts, look at your decisions, revise your plan.
All right, so we were in the state of not knowing. Like there is no one who has the crystal ball of exactly what's going to go down. So let's maybe talk across the panel about what scenarios should people run in preparation right now. Hint, hint, you should be running scenarios right now. But like what scenarios should people be running? Maybe Gabrielle, you want to start us off?
Yeah, it is definitely the crystal ball. It has been in high demand, as you can imagine, in the past few weeks. So we always talk about, the playbook, and I always say, like, as a washed up athlete, like it's the combination of your team and your plays. So in terms of the scenarios, right now, don't run them alone is all I have to say. It's identify that your teammates, and I would say the main teammates that kind of got left behind in the round one was finance, because some of the scenarios before you even jump to thinking about shifting supply chains is obviously to understand your facts. I think I've beaten that horse, is know your tariff code, know your country of origin, but then know the broader picture of like, okay, if we are looking at these tariff increases, if you're importing tangible product, you have a customs bond. So if those tariffs jack up, then your customs bond is going to blow out of the water. So get in front of finance to say, okay, our bond is currently for this amount, but we have to be prepared for, up to 60 to 100% on tariffs from China. We have to be prepared for Canada and Mexico. In terms of if your supply chains are relying on free trade agreements, take a look at those items that are currently claiming duty-free status between Canada and Mexico. So in terms of the scenarios, it's again, thinking about the financial impact, thinking about any trade agreements that you have in place. As you think about other countries to put your goods in, depending on what you have, there's other trade agreements in the world that you could potentially leverage for a certain product in other countries. So we have good trade agreements in place with loads of countries we can further talk about. And so just think about the free trade agreement factor. And then further, in terms of the tangible goods, think about the port impact. So if you are currently on a route, like if you have a freight forwarder, talk to them about what their plans are. They're another teammate that you can't ignore. They have the track and traceability of your physical shipments, meaning if a good hits the water and the tariffs jack up while your good's on the water, there's some rules in terms of customs on when those tariffs will be applied, but there's a lot to be able to navigate. There's a lot of gray space in there. So it's about, talk to finance, talk to your broker, your freight forwarders, understand what kind of track and traceability they have. And the fourth is internally, make sure your systems are tight, that when those lists get rolled out, like Scott and I were talking about, like down to the 10th digit, or if the tariff codes change or split or anything of that sort, what consolidated repository do you have to cross-reference? So when I work with clients, the first thing we do is we build that classification matrix. We do the tariff code, you do the duty rate, and then you start modeling scenarios. Country of origin China, boom. Country of origin Vietnam, before they melt that, here's that impact. So that then you correspond the tax and you're able to pull those levers and think about all that. So yeah, finance, brokers, internal systems. And I think those are the three main ones that we really saw be the most beneficial as the round one played out.
All right, Scott, what are your thoughts? What scenarios should people be running?
I would absolutely extend the finance team. I think the CFO is your greatest partner here. this is going to have a huge impact on the company, right? On your business. It's not just the bond, it's a reinvestment in all of your CapEx that it took to stand up your existing facility. It's that NPI budget when you initially launched your product. Your spend in 2025 is going to go through the roof in ways that 6 months ago, nobody was modeling. So you know, the audience here is really the subject matter experts in all things supply chain. Go own this. But the CFO needs to be informed. This is going to affect fundraising next year. This is going to affect NPI schedules next year. All of those scenarios, right? What does it look like to pay the tariff next year? Start at January 1st for worst case scenario. There are rules. They can't actually do that. He's not even president until much later. But, you know, for the sake of ease, start at January 1st and then layer in what a move looks like. Layer in that reinvestment. Look at what you were planning to do from an NPI standpoint and start having the discussion strategically about the trade-offs. And, you know, figure out your team, figure out your systems, and I mean, Jen can reinforce this, but start working the phone. Like, know who your partners are. Everybody in that network is on the same team to try and make your business successful. If you don't have a business, your suppliers don't have a customer. So it's a partnership. Pull in all the partners you can. This is
Folks who are already contracted with certain CMs in certain regions that are particularly at risk or they believe will be targeted, or part of that. In terms of the factory and like what they do about that. I mean, we talked about in advance a little bit about moving the factory. And so in terms of preparation and scenario modeling, what are some of the things that should be involved in the modeling of factory moves?
Jen, do you
Scott
want to? I'm happy to.
Yeah,
because I know
well,
Jen has much to say about this.
Yeah, well, this is, you know, manufacturing people and finance, the weird overlapping portion of our Venn diagram, value engineering, rarely is this strategic. So manufacturing people, this is your time. But the ways you could go at this are most folks in your org are going to be approaching this from a top-down perspective strategy. All of a sudden, people are going to be looking at you and asking you questions that haven't before. That's why I say it's our time to shine, or hide under a rock, depending on your personality profile. But please don't do that. Please give them the benefit of your experience. What can you do to feel prepared for those kinds of higher level conversations? Let's start ground up. So start with your bill of materials. Are your BOMs up to date? Do you have your alts and subs polished off? If you don't have alts and subs outside China, hint, hint, you probably should, even if they're much more expensive. Put that costed info on the alts and subs list and get your lead times up to date. Along with that, do something that is uncomfortable for some of us introverts. Polish off your phone skills, WhatsApp, WeChat, your actual phone, email, etc., all your communication channels, and start reaching back out to all the people in your network, all the vendors in your network. If you haven't done a great job of cultivating those relationships over the last 4 years, it happens. Reach back out, express interest in re-engaging, wish people happy holidays, send them an e-card, ask if they're going to be at CES, and suggest that you want to sit down and talk to them about supply chain readiness, right? This will not be a shock. Everyone is talking about this now. So if you're late to the party, just jump on as fast as you can. The next level above BOMs is sometimes we'll have things like should cost models, right? Where we know what our bill of materials is, but there's an aspirational level of what we think it should be based on our analysis, our competitive analysis, et cetera. I'm going to say for a minute, set your should cost model aside. You should immediately jump to working on a simple version of a quant spreadsheet that I call unit cost target modeling. So unit cost target modeling is going to have your bill of material breakouts, your HT, your HS, your HTS code, your tariff burden, and you're going to have extended line items because you're going to begin to model differences or deltas over time. But your manufacturing margin, right? Any other disty costs or costs that are otherwise hidden. And the reason to do this unit cost target spreadsheet is that this is going to be your Rosetta Stone, your tool to try to communicate with finance and other leaders outside of production and engineering that don't normally look at all these numbers. So consider this as a summary. This is an education tool that you're going to use to present these numbers to people and then talk about their definitions. Then what you do is you start to model out the contingencies. So once you have your unit cost target model set up, then you model 10%, 20%, 60%, 100%, 200% cost deltas so that your team can see what the impact would be as some of these changes are solidified. And I think what I would like to cement for everyone is that it is not a matter of whether or not there will be change. It is how much change, when, and when will this impact your bottom line. So you should start predicating these conversations with your strategic leadership now, so that they are prepared to approve plans that you put in front of them. I'm going to say no later than Q1 if you haven't done this already, because as Scott noted, these plans will take some time to be put into effect, but we know that they will be implemented. We also know that the executive decision cycle, even if you're a 5-person team, is going to involve a lot of discussions, particularly if the trade-offs and alternatives are painful ones or potentially painful ones. I'm also going to say reread, your incoterms documentation. You should be reviewing your contract manufacturing services agreement, your CMSA, or whatever your contract is with your CMs, if those are already in place. If those are up for renegotiation, start that now. Same thing with your carriers. Are you using an end-to-end freight forwarder? Look at those contracts. We'll get into this later, but based on what's happening in freight, ocean and otherwise, you should assume that there are going to be major changes to freight carriage as well in the new year, and that may impact you. So be prepared to cost model those out.
Can you connect the dots for people on why that would happen? Like as a ripple effect?
Yes. Yeah, we're looking at things like there's a variety of factors influencing particularly ocean freight. One is an agreement that's coming back up for potential finalization January 15th. And if there is no agreement, there will likely be port strikes and freight rerouting as a result of that. We're seeing an increasing number of stochastic 100-year weather events, et cetera, that are disrupting ports and other operations, including air freight. We're also seeing the aging of infrastructure at ports, et cetera. So some of these are new things like tariffs. Some of these are things that we've been seeing for most of the last decade. But all of these things may impact your bottom line of unit costs in the next 1 to 4 years. So you should take them all into consideration.
You mentioned that people are pulling forward, and I think I've heard this elsewhere in like mainstream media as well. People are pulling forward shipments, essentially Q2 and Q1, that kind of maybe even Q1 into Q4. There's obviously risks for that from a cash to cash perspective for certain size businesses. What are the ramifications, even if you and your company are not doing that for whatever reason? What are the ripple on ramifications of a broad pull forward? We kind of got to see that a little bit in the COVID era. And maybe you could help just kind of summarize for people how that could impact their business, even if they're not partaking in any pull forward activities.
Yeah, very high level. If you haven't done things yet, if you haven't readied for tariff impact yet or supply chain readiness yet, there are many other companies, good news, bad news scenario, many other companies, many other executive teams in the same boat. There are also lots of firms available, most of us sitting here who can help you figure out a strategy, but other companies are going to be doing the same thing at the same time that you are. And so that will introduce capacity constraints. In terms of freight, what we may see is a book of shipments drastically increasing in Q1. And then we expect as rates rise, et cetera, as tariffs sort of hit, as people sort of right size that through Q2 and Q3, we might see demand drop a bit and then capacity may increase again or availability may increase again. But for most of us, we're shipping on a holiday time cycle. And so that's going to hit like right as we're trying to ship for holiday. So most companies at this time are, if they've planned ahead, they were trying to build up inventory towards the end of this year and trying to get stuff out of country before Chinese New Year 2025 so that they can build up inventory stateside before tariffs hit.
All
Can
right.
I piggyback on 2 quick things because I thought of one more, and then Jen, I was really glad you brought up incoterms, and the other team member to pay attention to is contracts, often rolled into the finance department or someone wearing 12 hats as most startups are, but specifically under contracts, kind of the 3 main things are the incoterms and really understanding kind of two pieces of that is one, incoterms don't mean title transfer. So make sure that your contracts align your title transfer to your incoterms. And what I mean by that, title transfer in an incoterm, if your title transfers when the good gets to its destination, but your incoterm is at pass off, then there's like this responsibility and ownership misalignment. So just make sure, like, take a look at your title transfer, look at your incoterms. And then the other kind of pain point that we saw and why I point to contracts is if you look at your supplier clauses and just think about modeling. So if you're relying on your suppliers to provide like some of those facts we talked about, like your tariff codes and your country of origin, like, oh, well, they do it for us. Well, what happens when they're wrong? Because what we saw was a lot of holds in the ports, and this is part of the congestion. And companies are like, oh, well, that is our manufacturer provides us the country of origin. And customs is like, yeah, Vietnam doesn't usually manufacture these kinds of goods. And then now we're in a cycle of having to prove that it is in fact country of origin Vietnam. When customs is pressure testing is China, and then lo and behold, it is China because it didn't substantially transform in Vietnam. So make sure you have clauses in your contracts if there's that kind of relationship that would cover, your butt if you're getting misinformation from your suppliers. And then the other thing is just like, think about, can you put a price adjustment clause in your contract? So allow for price adjustments in response to these tariff increases. We saw some of our clients do that pretty successfully. So, again, like the incoterms, the title transfer, and then just thinking about if you're relying on partners for information from a contract standpoint, force majeure clauses, like Jen mentioned, the changing weather and the impact to that from a port perspective. Just think about everything. Turn over all the rocks, but look at your contracts and think about it from the tariff standpoint. And those are the main ones I'd say.
All right. Let's talk about, Scott kind of brought this up a little bit earlier about the potential for NPI impacts in 2025. For those on a Christmas schedule, usually you're trying to get your first build done in January, like either right before or right after Chinese New Year. So even if you're building not, outside of China, that generally tends to be the time that you're starting. And that means that many of those organizations are already like in contract right now with factories that they have selected, maybe even prior to the election. And so therefore, maybe in a situation where they're trying to figure that out. Let's talk about how tariffs will impact NPIs for 2025 and, thoughts around like the factory piece. Maybe Scott, you can kick us off there.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest trade-off is, I think, where you invest in 2025, right? And if you already have a contract and you have a factory and you're buying your ticket for January to head out for a build, you are where you are. I think you could put that aside and try and move if you've got an existing product and you want to try and move that is the trade-off. But with limited resources, with limited funds, with a limited team, trying to do both at the same time, I think is you can't please all people all the time.
To do both an NPI that's successful and move a factory.
And move the factory
if you've already started and you're in contract with a factory, you're the ship has sailed.
That's two different, you're starting over, right? Yeah. You're starting over, trying to find a partner, doing your due diligence. If you've got two teams, amazing, good for you, but probably not.
Okay, so it's a hard reset button. You have to decide whether
it's certainly it's an intersection, and you've got to pick a turn.
Last time we saw this, I think like our perspective from the instrumental side is like, frankly, a lot of NPIs got canceled. Do you have perspective on whether that would be like in the cards this time? Do you think that's like the right thing to do? Like anything to add around, like, do we predict that NPIs will get canceled? Do we predict that they'll be slower, that people will try to move them? I don't know. Thoughts on that?
I think some people may cancel them. Some may look at the numbers and say it's too much of a risk. Let's pause and reset. And if we launch 6 months later, we launch 6 months later, but let's pause and reset.
Yeah.
Others may not, right? So I think we're going to see all different outcomes. Some may play the wait and see game.
Yeah.
I think we'll see it all. And really the question is, as a business, what makes the most sense? What's the most responsible investment for your resources? Is it to delay launch and move now? Is it to continue with development, launch as is, take the margin hit, then move. That's a discussion for the executive team. That's a discussion for the board. But as supply chain leaders, I think this is, as we've all said, this is the opportunity to step up and own that analysis, own that recommendation, lay it out in front of them. You're the subject matter experts. Everybody is hearing pundits and talking heads and using big words that nobody understands. Everybody on this call will get the question, well, what if we just ship it to Canada first? The answer then as now is doesn't make a difference. The answer now is that's an even worse idea because they're talking about tariffs on imports from Canada anyway. So, you're going to get those questions. Go back to the facts. Those are irrelevant questions because they fly in the face of the facts.
Jen, you've been through the MPI gauntlet multiple times. How do you think this is going to impact MPI in 2025?
I think everything you said will happen. It's a yes and. It's not an either or. Unfortunately, it's a choose your own adventure novel. So some people will opt out, they'll opt to wait. Some teams will move very aggressively now that they recognize that this is what's happening. They will elect to move factories. They will move countries of manufacturing. They will move production sites. Some companies that have the benefit of a lot of dry powder may opt to parallel path. As Scott said, if you're lucky enough to have two teams, you should be setting up a CM and a team, standing up a team in another territory with an expected minimal tariff burden. Again, this is unpredictable to a certain extent, but there are locations that we think, based on what happened last time, are likely to have less of a burden, but there's no certainty. I will also say that you should be thinking a lot about that dry powder, even if you're production level, product owner, engineering manager, because of how it's going to impact your potential business. And as you're pulled into these higher level strategic conversations, if that's not usually where you play on your team, you may encounter requests for data like, if we do this and this, so we delay an NPI to next year, do I still stand up your entire team of FTEs during that year? Or if I have the same amount of capital, what do you recommend? Is there a headcount reduction or a correction in staffing to support that extension? So these are the kinds of questions that you may be asked and that you should be prepared for, at least as a contingency. Have a plan A, have a plan B, have a plan Q, and have modeled the math out to be able to make strategic recommendations or predictions. I would also say that the real goal here is to demonstrate flexibility in the kinds of plans that you're able to offer as options, and to have done all the background data and research you need to support those contingency plans. So this requires a lot of costing and R&D effort. If you don't have those capabilities on your team, start thinking about ways to use managed services or staff aug, et cetera. AI even, right? Start thinking about ways to make your team more efficient in this time to support data for those predictions.
Instrumental, maybe. What do we think is going to be different this time? We talked a little bit in my intro, I put that there's a little bit more uncertainty. We think they're going to be broader, but also just like on the company level. I know Jen and Gabrielle, you both have perspectives on what would be different. Jen, maybe you could share just quickly your perspective on what's going to be different, and then we'll go to Gabrielle.
Yeah, and speaking on what will be different here, for most of this conversation, I've taken the PwC hat off, right, and put on the CM hat and the startup hat, just because I think that's potentially more relevant and more helpful here, and enables me to speak from the scars learned last time. So what I think will be different this time is last time we had some pretty big exceptions for things like medical devices and components used in medical devices because of COVID. I think this time there will also be exception lists. There will be lists, but those will be influenced by PAC, political committee activity around some of the other hot button topics in this forthcoming administration's term. You can do a study of terms, search terms and news in Google for the last administration and this administration to come up with that delta. Just suggesting that's a good analysis to run if you haven't already. And that will show you that some things like defense, et cetera, infrastructure, similar programs to what we might have had with the WPA in the past. Those are likely to be areas of spend. So as a company, when you're thinking about where attention is going to be focused, that's a good place to look. You can also look at the differences between the allies that were verbalized prior to the last term and the allies that have been verbalized prior to this term, which are the same and which have changed. And that might give some insight into where we think tariff impacts will fall in this V2 of this administration.
Gabrielle, anything to add here?
Yeah, I think that the big one that we saw in the first was the layering, and this is specific to country products coming out of China, is the layering of the Section 301 on top of existing free trade agreements. And the big kind of black hole is how is that going to affect companies now with the Canada-Mexico threat on the tariffs, and now with just the state of the Section 301 that will be furthered with goods out of China. It's just really taking a look again at those free trade agreement, if you are leveraging those and thinking about and modeling, going back to the modeling, what happens if you lose that free trade agreement? In terms of folks inside my industry, we are still scratching our heads as to how it could override the free trade agreements, but that's kind of the big black box in terms of modeling for that, because the last round we did not see kind of the Canada-Mexico piece, right? The second piece, and it's not so much what will be different, but it's just I wanted to add one more tool to those of you who have, again, those tangible imports. If you don't have access to ACE, which is the automated commercial environment, it is the system of record for all imports and exports in and out of the United States. So if you're working with a broker or forwarder who is handling your actual volumes on your behalf, this is a free tool that you have access to. So as a company, you're going to have your own sales reports, but this is a report of what the government sees of your goods. So in terms of, there's a lot of strategy in terms of leveraging those reports and looking at those reports in terms of thinking about who the allies are, what countries will be targeted, because those reports have your country of origin on them. So it allows you to kind of shift your data around to help the modeling. The third and last thing that we think is going to be different this time is, again, the focus. I'm going back to my recipe talk, is that we're so hung up on the tariffs, on the tangible goods. And there is obviously also in the news, this big drive on how do we regulate AI? And we've been involved with a lot of AI committees out of DC and just the exports, controls surrounding who are we giving our recipe to? What nations are we sharing, our contract manufacturing information? Are we using AI? How are we going to regulate AI? So I think it's like Jen said, it's both. It's going to be an and so there's no import without the export side of the house. So as you're thinking and modeling about this and identifying your facts, add your export controls to your facts, because we think that there's going to be an increase in enforcement on that as well.
All right. Maybe as the last question, we attempted to kind of get on like what it would take to move a factory. And it sounded like the general consensus was, well, everybody's going to try different stuff. So some people are going to try to move, some aren't going to move, some are going to, we'll see. But I guess if you're modeling scenarios where you're gonna potentially attempt to move a factory, are there any like lessons learned, just quick tidbits here as kind of a last question, and then we'll get to the Q&A that's been building up. So if you have a question, if you put it in the chat, please put it in the Q&A. That just helps us like actually make sure we get to them all. And maybe in the intervening time, let's talk about just like the nuts and bolts of moving a factory and any tips or lessons learned from that.
I mean, so one, I think it goes in phases, right? And to the point of country of origin and substantial transformation, the first thing you're going to look at is where you're doing final assembly. You may not save money there. It may still be more expensive, even without the tariff once you move, especially given all of the other factors in play right now with everybody's looking for capacity. So there's a run on demand for labor, which means the wages are going to go up. Everybody's trying to pull in shipments, which means not only are they pulling in components and building ahead, raising those prices, but they're all fighting for the same containers and the same ships. So you're going to see freight costs increase. Once that, let's say you get through all that settles, then you have your secondary supply chain. Because if you're in production right now, the likelihood is all of your components are coming from somewhere in China that's hopefully pretty close to where you're doing final assembly. So your next step is to start picking up and moving some of those key pieces as well to get them closer to where you're doing final assembly. Think packaging, think large mechanical pieces. So this goes in waves. You just got to take one bite at a time, start with that final assembly piece, go forward, keep marching. The other piece I would add to what's going to be different this time, I think last time there was a fair amount of forgiveness from boards, given that it was seemingly out of the blue and nobody could believe it was happening. That forgiveness has likely been used up and is gone. So if you don't have a plan, that's not the right answer. The answer is the plan that you're going to write as soon as you log off and keep working on that plan.
Jen, anything to add around moving factories?
Yeah, I would say that moving factories in if you've ever had this quoted, the promise is offered in like 3 to 6 months. I've never actually accomplished that. I've seen it take 9 to 12 months in the best case scenario pre-COVID. And that was with in country. So location in China, other factory, redundant line in China. So when you talk about jumping outside China proper, add some time, add a quarter or more. When you consider that many other folks are going to be trying the same thing, add a quarter or more. Now also consider that contract manufacturing teams have a multitude of lesson learned from 2018 to roughly 2022, and they are much more discerning in the clients that they will select or agree to work with. So there's no guarantee that the CM partner or site that you select will agree to take on your business, particularly in this environment where they're going to have a glut of choice. So you have to consider that the package that you send for RFP, RFQ is a marketing piece. And you should be, if you haven't already done this, my suggestion would be consider taking whatever your last NPI was, pull together the RFP, RFQ materials from that NPI, and consider repackaging that and sending it out for current quote in a variety of territories to start to see how long does the RFP, RFQ take to come back. It's probably going to be in excess of 8 weeks. But you need that data for some of your modeling and to even see if moving factories before the middle of next year is a contingency plan that is feasible for your company.
Yeah, some of the things we've learned from customers who have been working on moving factories, regardless of whether it was during tariffs or during other times where they're working to move, there's some like core takeaways, like try not to shut down the first line before your second site is up and running, because you can end up in a gap and then you have no revenue. That's a problem. So like but like having 2 sites running at the same time is very expensive. So like there's that problem. The fact that like a lot of the recipe isn't really documented super well, like the SOP is not actually what people are doing to make it. And there's expertise that's developed with your partner, that even if you're moving with the same company, or if you're moving with a different company in a different territory, like you got to go and like vacuum up all that information and know-how as much as you can to try to give yourself. That's why it takes so long. You have to essentially have to redo MPI. We've worked with companies who like moved at DBT, and they essentially were able to only have to insert 1 additional build and they were still able to ship. So like, I think there are opportunities depending on how well you prepare and your plan for like recognizing the fact that there's a lot of know-how in building your product that you might not be thinking about from a spreadsheet perspective as you're looking at the models. We have some great questions, so let's pivot to those. So Sarah asked, in anticipation of the tariffs, would it be wise to build up strategic inventory? Has anyone on the panel done this in the past? Short-term fix might skew the BOM cost. Wanted to get an idea from a scrappy startup perspective with not a lot of capital.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen it done. It's a numbers game and a hedge, right? How much of next year's anticipated sales, how would you benefit? What's your cost of capital? Are there other things you need to be doing with that cash flow? Do you have the cash on hand to be able to pay for that inventory, to support the larger bond for that higher volume of inventory that's coming in? It's something that can be done, but it's not a long-term fix. It'll buy you a couple months of tariff-free inventory to sell in the second half of next year, probably.
Yeah, and
What
thinking
you
about,
Oh, sorry,
and
go
thinking
ahead,
about, like,
Gabby.
the other, there's a lot of other strategies in front loading that we certainly are seeing, some clients do, kind of push to the finish line, right, with front loading all these shipments. So when you enter the United States, you deposit duty once your product enters the market of the United States. So there's a few ways to put a stopgap on it entering the market of the United States. And one of that is entering it into a bonded warehouse. So you would store it. And obviously, like to Scott's point, that's going to come with a fee on renting and using the space in the bonded warehouse. But you wouldn't be, you'd want to deposit the lower tariff rated items now, but ultimately know about this. There are bonded warehouses. So this is for you to know about, also in the event of when the tariffs go up, you can leverage this. There are free trade zones for you to manufacture in. But the one that a lot of our clients who are currently front loading and clearing and paying the duties right now are thinking about counting on is the drawback program. So the United States has a drawback program, which means that you can clear your volumes now, deposit the duty in the, on your product now. And at a later point in time, within the next 3 to 5 years, you have the opportunity to re-export it, whether it be to your customers or back to the factory, and draw back the duties that you deposited. So it's not a simple process, it's complex. It's like the one offering we don't do. There are a lot of really great drawback service providers out there. Again, you need really solid data, sales reports, customs clearance reports. So again, back to your team, when you're talking to your brokers and your freight forwarders, ask them if they can support a drawback program. Ask them how they would store data to support the drawback of duties if you think that that is something you want to explore. Sorry,
I would say
Jen.
there's no worries. Everybody has great advice. There are two ways to think about this from the startup perspective, or from the small co perspective. One is that you can hedge some risk at the component level, and you may want to do that. You may want to line by line review your bill of materials. Reach out to the brokers that you work with, or the primary suppliers for those materials. Let's call it like the top third of your BOM that's at risk. Reach out to them and ask what they're seeing with demand, with dock dates, double check on EOL, do the normal bill of material hygiene. But that's because some of these components will go into a short sell situation where larger companies, Fruit Co. and others will stockpile. They'll disappear from your ability to get at them in the market, or you'll have to pay ridiculous exponential increases for spot buys. So consider that analysis, running that analysis if you haven't already, and then reaching out to your favorite broker or 2 or 3 or 8, and get their feedback on what's happening with those components in the market and make plans accordingly. That's the hedge against BOM cost increase, right? But then you have the finished good inventory cost risk that we're talking about here. I think it's worth noting that there's a couple things you can do. You can consider negotiating with your contract manufacturer to store on site pre-FGI. You can consider asking your contract manufacturer to work up a quote to become your bonded warehouse, because bonded warehouse space will be in short supply, and you may have to try to find capacity there. Some CMs are willing to do this. So that's worth an ask at minimum. And look for bonded warehousing space around your current facility and or contract manufacturing site. You may also want to look up the nearest free trade zone to your company's HQ in the US and consider laying in some FGI there, even if it's small quantity, so that you have some goods stateside prior to any related increases that we're going to see in Q1.
I think the other thing from a startup perspective to think about is the cash to cash time. You'll have to have paid for those goods and then you'll be sitting on them, and that's going to consume a lot of your capital. And so be a little bit concerned about make sure you have enough of that capital. And then I think the other thing to just not do that might be tempting to do is to not stuff the channel here before the end of December. Because yeah, you're going to have great revenue numbers this year, but if you're going to try to raise next year, like having stuff the channel and like demand goes down, you can end up in a bad spot unless things, just happen to work out because demand is crazy high. But I think that's more of an edge case than like the nominal case. So just some other cautionary tales around like stockpiling and channel stuffing associated with tariff avoidance. All right. Next one. From Andre, we see clients embracing bringing FATP in-house in the US. Pro or con? Does it depend on certain types of products? And any advice on importing subassemblies?
It run the numbers. When you're importing subassemblies, you go from 1 to 2 HTS codes to 50 to 100. That becomes a lot more things to manage, especially in this time when everything's changing. But look at the numbers. There are cases where it's actually a reasonable process and it might pencil out. Not a horrible idea. I would not be surprised to see incentives and benefits if you can angle it correctly to doing that. But in some cases, we don't have a dearth of manufacturing capability in the US, sadly. We don't have the skill sets, we don't have the facilities, we lack a lot of it. So, if you want to be part of building that up, yes, please do. But it's going to take work, right? It's going to be longer than it would elsewhere, where there are suppliers all over who have pools of labor ready to go.
And it might not get you out of the tariff codes, right? Because if you're
That's
importing sub-assemblies, it's not like to what avail, are you bringing it into the United States, especially with the final assembly testing and packing, just doing injection molding in the United States is not going to change that country of origin to get you out of the tariffs. So it's really back to understanding, what specifically, like why are you doing it? Is it to bring it closer to protect it? But from a country of origin standpoint, my talking point here is just make sure if you're looking at moving your factories, if you're looking at bringing this in the United States, is thinking about that tariff impact and whether the country of origin is going to change and be substantially transformed.
What Scott and Gabrielle have both said, and thanks for the question, Andre. There are categories of goods that it still seems to make economic sense to manufacture in the US. There are categories of goods where those supply chains and the talent and the skill sets have moved offshore. To a certain extent, efforts over the last administration to reshore, including semiconductor manufacturing, et cetera, varying degrees of success and maturity, right? So again, can the reshoring capabilities for the categories of goods of the folks on these call be supported by the capabilities and capacity that we currently have in the US? Probably not. But that is one of the underlying goals of these tariffs, right? Is to incentivize or motivate reshoring or onshoring. That being said, I would also say that there are contract manufacturers who have lessons learned again from the last era of this administration, who set up capacity, who imported teams, and who have had some capacity sort of waiting in reserve for this eventuality. So I would say look for those. There are also sectors of goods that have already migrated out of China because of risk. So I would say find those companies, make friends with folks that work for them, and ask their advice for how they set up their supply chains for onshoring or reshoring.
Yeah, I would maybe just add, I've been really surprised to discover that yields for products that you would, or for pieces and subassemblies that you would expect certain yields in Asia or greater Asia, just like totally different here in the United States. Like we are so used to 99% yields out of SMT or SMA, right? And that doesn't happen in the United States for whatever reason. I don't understand it. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. We've solved that problem. Like, why can we not figure that out? But like, I continually encounter customers building here in the United States where SMA yields could be 80%. Like, I'm talking first pass yield through, and that could be good. Final, first pass yields at final assembly could be low as well. Granted, that's in some cases, In other cases, we work with companies, or I'm aware of companies with founders who essentially built their own factories. And they hire their own workers, and it's for certain types of products that can make sense. So to your question, Andre, like if the product is $1,000 product, or it's hardware supported SaaS, where like most of the money you make is not in selling this hardware, those are the types of products that I think you could be potential candidates for making sense to like make your own factory, hire your own people to do it. You're going to get your own yields, get your own expertise and ownership. And I think that can work if your volumes are like a certain smaller size, and the value and the product value is high enough. But if you're trying to build a consumer electronic device at super high volumes, like I think that would be very challenging to do, as this panel has described. Like a lot of that expertise doesn't exist here. The supply chain doesn't exist here, to be able to support something like that. So things to think about. I think we got through everyone's questions and we're right at the top of the hour. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. We will be having a recording of this that we'll send out. We're also working on a guide to moving factories. If that's something that you're thinking about, what should I consider as part of that? So we'll be sharing that as well. Keep the questions coming offline. All of these experts are certainly willing and open to hearing your thoughts and feedback and questions about how to navigate these different challenges. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.